Just to tell you a little bit about myself before we start. I'm a gay male who grew up in the southern United States, and for some reason, unbeknownst even to me, I chose to stay in that region for college. This was in the early 2000s, directly post 9/11. A huge chunk of the people, both students and faculty and staff, were quite politically and religiously conservative in their thinking. While I disliked that aspect, it was not at all unfamiliar to me. The post 9/11 aftermath only served to amplify the whole God, family, and country mentality. Unlike many of my fellow LGBT students, I admittedly had a chip on my shoulder about it. Contrary to what some may think, there are bastions of liberal, progressive belief, even in such an environment, and such groups and circles were quite supportive of anyone who chose to be openly opposed to the predominant mindset. As such, I felt sufficiently assured and confident to be out and proud, as well as non-conventional in other ways. If all that were not enough, I've never been one to exhibit that stereotypical southern warmth and extroversion. I may be courteous and civil, but I'm also quite happy for strangers to remain strangers. Of course, all this is to say that somehow, for reasons I still cannot grasp, I ended up on the radar of some dude, the titular would-be friend, whose time and energy probably would have been much better spent on someone more amenable and compatible. And before I continue, let me also emphasize the second part of the title. The guy's refusal to take no for an answer. You'll see what I mean. Trust me. So, in the midst of my senior year of college, engaged in such tasks as completing what's left of my degree requirements, applying to grad programs, and just generally finishing off my undergrad career on an uplifting note. I had my meals in the university cafeteria, where I'd eaten either in solitude or with a few friends, depending on our schedules. One day, though, I'm just eating my lunch, or dinner, rather, and some guy just comes up, sits down near me, and starts chatting me up, introducing himself as Ron. Right away, this Ron guy is obviously quite outgoing and extroverted, and he really seems to be one of those types who's never met a stranger. He was seemingly trying to get to know me by striking up a conversation, and as we tend to say in the Reddit, "let's not meet," I thought nothing of it. For my own part, where I did not share his interest in socializing, I was not adverse to the interaction or repelled by him either. He seemed like a decent and personable enough guy, so I made some effort to be nice and participate in the conversation, if only passively. And that's generally how it goes with me. I'm not especially motivated to reach out to strangers in attempt to socialize, but depending on the situation and context, I tend to be cooperative and cordial to someone who tries to chat me up, by making some effort to respond to their prompts. I know what it's like to feel ignored or unheard, because the other person gives only the most terse and emotionless response. So I generally try to do better by offering actual substantive responses to their statements and questions. In that respect, I suppose the traditional Southern preoccupation with manners and politeness did, in fact, rub off on me, in a manner of speaking. All that said, if I'm not feeling a mutual interest and desire to engage, then I'm not feeling it. It's nothing personal against the other, but I can't force it either. Usually for me to develop a friendship with a new person, it involves some combination of the following. Some common interest, shared activity, or other type of common ground. Repeated casual and friendly interactions over some span of time. Again, though, if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. To continue, as it turned out, Ron was a freshman, so he was a few years younger than me, with a bit less life experience by comparison. Moreover, this was likely his first time living in a novel environment away from his more familiar surroundings of home, school, and church. Finally, with Ron being such an outgoing guy, it's possible he was very well accustomed to successfully making friends with new people by spontaneously approaching and chatting them up. Combine that with my non-committal politeness, and I suppose he decided that I was going to be a new addition to his social circle. Again, at this stage, I had nothing against the guy, because he seemed like a perfectly decent fellow. So when he wanted to exchange phone numbers, I complied. And when he talked about wanting to hang out sometime, I was copacetic to the idea. In other words, I had no genuine interest in doing so, but I was not actively opposed to the idea either. As some weeks and months passed, he did continue to pursue the idea. Problem was, although I was amenable to the idea, I was only amenable to in theory. In reality, though, I simply had no interest in this person and, therefore, no motivation to reciprocate or pursue a friendship. Right now, some people may think I should have simply told him directly that I was not interested. Assuming you read the title of this post, though, perhaps you may not be so quick to assume that would have worked in my case. Regardless, though, I simply declined to reciprocate his efforts. You can think what you will of me. You can judge me either for not wanting to be friends or for not directly saying, "Sorry, not interested." Either way, if I'm not reciprocating, then surely the most logical response on his part would have been to simply realize I'm not interested and move on. Right? Well, that's now how Ron would end up dealing with it. And in hindsight, his subsequent behavior completely validates my initial distance and non-engagement. Maybe I unconsciously perceived he was someone I'd rather avoid. Like I said, at first the guy was simply friendly and polite, if a bit excessively persistent, about his efforts to befriend me, so I really had nothing against him either. I probably imagined in the back of my mind that he would just give up and move on, of his own accord. Instead, one day in the college cafeteria, he approached me per usual and seems his usual outgoing and friendly self. But then he switches gears and confronts me, Ron didn't raise his voice, or even verbally attack me, really. If anything, his tone was somewhat casual and civil. He brings up the fact I had not reciprocated his efforts in a fairly accusatory manner. As I recall, something like, you've been kinda rude to me. Basically, in his mind, it was a matter of him kindly offering a hand of friendship, and me kindly rejecting it. My rudeness, apparently, consisted of me never calling him or taking him up on his hands of friendship he was supposedly extending. I guess he thought he would admonish me for my misdeeds, and I would feel repentant over it, and consequently mend my ways. Problem is, I have a heightened sensitivity to any kind of attempt at manipulating me via guilt, shame, cajoling, self-doubt, gaslighting, etc. On account of experiencing such things while growing up. Statements like, "Well, I'd be ashamed. That's just selfish. I was really disappointed that you did or didn't do X, Y, or Z. Now, what would your grandmother think? Well, that's just silly." By sensitive, I didn't mean that it works well on me. On the contrary, I mean that it makes my hair stand on end and generally puts me on high alert. If I was politely uncompliant before, then I'll be overly hostile and adversarial afterwards. On some levels, I'm basically thinking, that's it, screw you. Trifle with my thoughts or emotions. I think not. Needless to say, Ron's attempt at scolding me had the exact opposite effect of whatever he intended. I had nothing against him previously, but him coming at me like that really flipped a mental switch. I was not yet of a mind to be confrontational or hostile, but I no longer felt any obligation to be nice either. The exchange that followed was, to put it mildly, very awkward and uncomfortable. And in hindsight, it was the first sign that he had some difficulty in respecting other people's boundaries and personal autonomy. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I basically rejected his take on events and maintained I did nothing wrong. I simply told him I had been as courteous as I could be reasonably expected under the circumstances. Following his pushy badgering, my reserves of niceness had already run out. My overall attitude was one of, sorry you feel that way, but too bad. After all, if I don't want to be someone's friend, they don't have to like it, but it's still my prerogative to make that call, right? Not in Ron's mind, though. And he came at me with this. What if I expected more out of you? Then you have a problem there. Quite honestly, I was completely taken aback by this. From my perspective, I had no problem because of the simple fact that his expectations are no concern of mine. Like, did he sincerely believe that any expectations that he formed entailed some manner or moral or ethical obligation on my part? Really, what kind of person thinks like that? Needless to say, I didn't know how to respond because, well, it's fruitless attempting to reason with the unreasonable. Goddamn Ron then went on to ask why I had not returned his gesture of friendship, to which I simply responded honestly that I'd never felt compelled to do so. Naturally, he wants to know, why not? I could only think to myself, what the F? I'm now expected to justify my lack of a desire to be friends. I wish I'd been more of a smartass and said something like, why am I not compelled? How about the lack of a reason that I would be compelled? I could not even fathom what an effective statement in response would sound like. What is this guy's problem? I mean, this guy's thoughts, statements, and behavior, none of this is rational. Around this time, having to deal with him was awkward and distressing, thanks in no small part to my growing sense of having momentarily stumbled out of reality. Looking back, I realized he was basically engaging in a form of gaslighting. Though perhaps not knowingly, as he seemed to genuinely believe in his own words, however nonsensical I found them. The interaction ended on a sour note. He put on this demeanor like I disappointed him, while I was just uncomfortable and more than eager to move on. I had hoped that that was the end of it, and we'd thereafter just go our separate ways and not speak anymore. That's what I hoped, anyway. Instead, it was only a short while later, about maybe 3 weeks or so, that Ron approached me in the cafeteria again, putting on this default friendly, outgoing demeanor like our previous interaction hadn't happened at all. I still remembered it though, so I was quite taken aback that he was actually attempting to engage me again. Just like, oh hey man, what's up? At this point, he was just inviting himself into my personal space, where he was not welcome, and generally being inappropriately pushy. But this is really where I went from passively averse to actively hostile, because frankly, enough was enough. As previously mentioned, while I may not be friendly in the extroverted outgoing sense, I am generally nice in that I am polite, civil, and non-confrontational, and sometimes embarrassingly, a bit of a pushover. Until I'm not. At first, I didn't even bother responding because, by then, he should have known full well that any communication from him was completely unwelcome. The silent treatment may be petty, but I really didn't care. Of course, he just had to inquire as to why I didn't respond, so I just said to him word for word, "Get the hell away from me." I didn't even raise my voice, yet my tone was unmistakable, leaving no room for argument. He got this hurt puppy dog look on his face, and needless to say, he did not get the hell away from me. Instead, he decides to stick around and interrogate and challenge my sentiment, wanting to know what he can do to reconcile or whatever. Rather than dignify his nonsense by directly engaging, I simply reiterate that I want nothing to do with him. I was honestly tired of his crap, and I cut him off when he tried to protest or plead his case. The dude continued to persist for a while, but thankfully he did eventually give up and walk away. Surely after that, he gave up for good and left me alone, right? After all, being told to get the hell away from somebody surely establishes unmistakably that a friendship is off the table, right? For a much longer time, he didn't approach me. He passed me on the sidewalk once and said, "Good afternoon," but I didn't say a word back. It seemed like he was really going to leave me alone from that point forward. As you may guess, though, it didn't last. About 2 months later, in the cafeteria, he approached me again. He started off with an apology, and in a moment of optimism, I thought maybe he was going to apologize for having been so pushy in the past and go on his merry way. Wrong. Instead, he simply started the same old crap about how he wanted to be friends. Needless to say, I let him know that I had no interest in that. You know, the same thing that I expressed multiple times already, in such explicit terms that even a complete idiot could not have mistaken my meaning. Then, he started begging me for an explanation, which I absolutely did not owe him. I stupidly made an attempt at some form of explanation by pointing out his behavior at the time, namely disrespecting my wishes and invading my personal space. He then had the nerve to say things like that it was not an issue of personal space, that I was making stuff up. I even tried pointing out that this kind of persistent, pushy, space-invading, boundary-violating behavior spoke very poorly of him as a person, and he's just in denial that his behavior reflects on his character at all. Also, it may have been the encounter or another one, but I also made a point of showing Ron my cell phone. You see, at some point before that encounter, I had saved the phone number of the, wait for it, campus police so that I could report him if needed. I flipped open my phone in order to show him my entry for the campus police, just to drive home the fact that I was not playing and was quite ready to escalate things to that level if he wouldn't leave me alone. You would think that would have been enough for him to immediately disengage and walk away, both physically and psychologically. Nope. He actually stuck around and continued attempting to try to argue and plead with me. Eventually, the interaction mercifully ended because I was finished with lunch. Or was it dinner? Either way, good riddance. It was puzzling as hell, the whole damn scenario. Even some of my friends were wondering, why is he even so desperate to be friends with somebody who doesn't want to be friends with him? Granted, I was not afraid in this situation. I never worried he was going to ambush me in order to attack or kill me. What I did feel, though, was violated in my boundaries and personal space. I mean, if we cross paths in common campus area, like the cafeteria, and I didn't want to engage, it was up to me to leave. Distressed because he was invading that space and imposing his presence and interaction upon me against my will. And worst of all, powerless. He was not deterred by non-engagement and silence, open rejection and refusal, being told to get the hell away from me, or even my clearly stated willingness to involve law enforcement. And getting physical was naturally not a viable option, because that would have simply put me on the wrong side of the law. Soon enough, I just simply graduated college, so I never had to see him again anyway. He never tried to contact me after college either, thank goodness. On the other hand, being the petty bastard that I am, some small part of me almost wants to look him up and send some kind of message like, "Hey scumbag, it's been a while. Random question, do you still stalk people in order to badger and harass them into being friends with you against their will? Just curious." I would never actually do that, mind you. And although thinking about it may cause me to feel the irritation and indignation once again, it does not affect my life, however distressing and upsetting it was at the time. At least I was never actually scared or traumatized by it. In fact, to tell the story today, I'd probably do so in a spirit of dark amusement, more than anything else. So, Ron, let's never meet, ever again. Thank you all for listening to my telling of this tale. Please, if you would be so kind, leave me a like and share this video. And if you have not already, subscribe so as to listen to me more. May your nightmares be filled with terror, and may they be plentiful. Till next time, farewell.